Okay, hi everybody. So I want to give you an update on the Caster Semenya situation and her spat with World Athletics. The IAAF as was, they renamed themselves back in November last year. And as you may recall, Caster Semenya had fallen foul of their DSD regulations, which meant that she could no longer compete in women's athletics in the events she usually competes at unless she reduced her testosterone level to below 10 nanomoles, something which she refuses to do. So she took them to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Back early last year, she lost that case of the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and so she appealed to the Swiss Federal Supreme Court. I can tell you that as of the press release dated 8th of September this year, about a week ago now, she has lost that appeal to the Swiss Federal Supreme Court. Not only that, that court has said that although she has other avenues open to her, for example, they give the European Court of Human Rights as an avenue she could go down. In the press release itself, so this is publicly, they are dissuading her from doing it. They're saying you may as well not bother because they view the same issues that we've been viewing in the same way that we do. And so it's highly unlikely that that appeal would work because they have the same concerns that the Swiss Federal Supreme Court has. So that's your sort of Cliff Notes version. If that's all you're interested in, that bit of the news, then that is it. What I want to do is have a little bit of a kind of discussion over this, albeit it's a sort of one-sided discussion, but I've tried to think of what all the points could be. So I want to go through the press release of that. I want to give you some background first, just to refresh your memory as to what this is all about. I then want to discuss some of the way the media has been portraying this and give you an example of that with the way that the BBC is still reporting this. I want to talk about the way that Caster Semenya has been representing this in a way that I think is somewhat disingenuous, and she's sort of fed off the back of the misinformation that's been out there and hasn't been this paragon of virtue that she's been portrayed as over the last decade, as far as I'm concerned. I then want to talk about the way that Stonewall UK dealt with this on Twitter back at the end there. And there's quite a lot of things in between that I want to talk about. So let me just kick this off by sort of getting you up to speed. So there appeared to be a problem in women's athletics, and there has been for some time, which is that this is a protected category, of course. In this case, designed to exclude those who have the benefits of male pubertal development. But whereas with other protected categories, such as age categories or weight categories, they're quite easy to measure and in quite non-intrusive ways, it's not quite the same when we're talking about sex and what people's sex is. So these have been issues for a long time now. And indeed, Caster Semenya has been a bit of a thorn in the side because of the nature of her condition, which the IAAF has known, but we have not been party to due to her medical confidentiality, which she has rigorously upheld. And I propose to you later in this video, that's because she knows that she's got a lot more sympathy from people on the basis of the misunderstandings that they are operating on. But this has a big impact. If you go back to the Rio 2016 Olympics, which is still the last Summer Olympics, because of course the Tokyo Olympics has been postponed this year. In the 800 meters, which is her main event, the podium was made up of three athletes: Caster Semenya, Francine Niyonsaba and Margaret Wambui. All three of them have these differences of sex development. All three of them have differences of sex development that are categorized as differences of sex development that affect biological males. So technically speaking, the entire podium in the women's 800 meters is made up of biological males, or at least people who are close to, in a sporting sense, what you would regard as biological males. They all have testes that kick out male levels of testosterone and not ovaries. Okay, so the IAAF, as was at the time, came out with these regulations, the eligibility regulations for the female classification, athletes with differences of sex development, and they listed Not every difference of sex development. They listed 5 effectively, although the 5th is a little bit of a coverall. And these were the 5. 5 alpha reductase type 2 deficiency, partial androgen insensitivity syndrome, 17 beta hydroxysteroid hydrogenase type 3 deficiency. Trips off the tongue, that one, doesn't it? Ovotesticular DSD, and any other genetic disorder involving disordered gonadal steroidogenesis. And as a result of that, and 2 other qualifying criteria as well, also have to be true. As a result, she has circulating testosterone levels in blood of 5 nanomoles or above, and also she has sufficient androgen sensitivity for those levels of testosterone to have a material androgenizing effect. Okay, so those were the criteria that they laid down. Now, it must also be mentioned that the IAAF were at pains at the time to clarify that these regulations only applied to athletes who had DSDs that affect males, that are 46XY. That if you had an elevated level of testosterone, but you are 46XX, then that is fine. You are a female miracle with a high level of testosterone, and we would let that go in just the same way as we'd let anybody else with any sort of genetic mutation go under normal circumstances. But what they would not let go is people who are effectively biologically male competing in a category intended for biological females just because they were erroneously assigned the wrong sex at birth. So that was the situation, and that was the situation that Caster Semenya effectively was in. But she wasn't happy with that, so she appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Now, another little axis of importance here that you must be aware of, that effectively Caster Semenya became a kind of cause célèbre for, I like the way I pronounce that actually, for that body of the sort of pro-trans athletes side who feel it's sort of inclusion at any cost. It doesn't really matter about fairness. It doesn't matter whether there's an advantage, that these other things sort of override all of that. And so effectively they saw Caster Semenya as a happy bedfellow there, because what applies to Semenya applies to them. What applies to these athletes with differences of sex development applies to them, even though they are slightly different things. The interesting thing is, if you read the full document, the full court document from the Court of Arbitration for Sport, in the modern parlance, Caster Semenya and Athletic South Africa's teams threw them under the bus, because what they did is they said, look, the trans issue is a totally separate issue. What we're saying applies to Caster doesn't apply to them. It's fine. Trans women must reduce their hormone levels to account for their testes, right? But Caster Semenya shouldn't have to. Effectively, if the mistake was made at birth, you get a free pass or something. Right, that was sort of their case. So it's kind of interesting that these people sort of see her as on their side, and her counsel did everything they could to distance her case from their position. But anyway, she lost that case, and it's important also to note, I shall say this right now, that I've read this out in videos before, is that the Court of Arbitration for Sport as well as World Athletics were both at pains to acknowledge that the point of segregation in women's sport is not gender identity, it is not legal sex, but it is biological sex, right? That is the intended point of segregation, and so that is the important thing. It's not whether you regard yourself as a woman, it's not whether it says female on your legal documents, it's whether you are biologically female. That is the intention of that sporting boundary, that sporting protected category. Important to bear that in mind. So moving on to the Swiss Federal Supreme Court then. First, let me just say something that I get a bit annoyed with these egregious appeals to the Swiss court. This is just one of them, but these things have become more and more common. And let me try and explain why. In fact, one of the things that the South African government has been particularly pointed in its abuse and condemnation of is that we always seem to work to white European standards with all these things, right? And one of the points of the Court of Arbitration for Sport is to take the geographical differences that we have out of it and have a separate body that decides for the whole world. But unfortunately, that body has to be situated somewhere. You have to have a physical building there, right, and say this is the headquarters of this court. And of course, that then becomes under the umbrella of the national jurisdiction of which it is in. And so there has been kind of the idea has been, you imagine if you were to try and function sport with every international sport, with every country working to its same standards, right? It just wouldn't work. Imagine if one country said, well, our laws on age discrimination don't allow it under any circumstances. So a 30-year-old, as far as we're concerned, can compete in an under-21s team because otherwise it would be egregious discrimination and it would fall foul of the law. That would never work, would it? How can everybody work to different standards? So the idea of the Court of Arbitration for Sport meant that all these different sporting bodies, the IOC, World Athletics, and all the others, can set their own standards that applies to all the countries around the world, independent of the individual jurisdictions of these different countries. And indeed, most countries, when it comes to sport and their discrimination legislations, have caveats for sport because they realise that you have to do so. Because without having a caveat for sport, you can't discriminate in the ways we need to with sport. We need to discriminate on the grounds of size, on the grounds of age, on the grounds of sex. Otherwise, we couldn't have these different categories for people to compete in the first place. So the problem then is, if you then start appealing to the Swiss court, effectively what happens is Swiss law starts determining what everybody else in the world has to do. And I think that's a problem then. Then the national legislation of one nation starts determining what happens in the rest of the world, in sport for the rest of the world. This is why the idea was that you would not appeal against CAS decisions to a national court unless it was on the grounds of procedure. If the Court of Arbitration for Sport had done something really surreptitious, and not applied their regulations properly on a matter of principle and process, then you would appeal, but otherwise you wouldn't. Unfortunately, that seems more and more to be going out the window. If people think they have a chance of appealing, they will do so. And this is what happened here. Okay, let me read you a little bit of what was said. Now I've got that off my chest. The Swiss Federal Supreme Court dismisses the appeal submitted by the South African athlete Caster Semenya and her Athletics Federation against the decision of the Court of Arbitration for Sport on the eligibility regulations for the female classification athletes with differences of sex development DSD regulations. The Court of Arbitration for Sport had the right to uphold the conditions of participation issued for female athletes with the genetic variant 46XY-DSD in order to guarantee fair competition for certain running disciplines in female athletics. Okay. They then went on. I'm going to read you a fair chunk of this now because then I want to talk about some of what was in it. Caster Semenya and ASA appealed to the Swiss Federal Supreme Court against the CAS decision. It rejects both appeals. As an independent court of arbitration, the CAS has comprehensively examined the Caster Semenya case and consulted numerous experts. For its part, the Swiss Federal Supreme Court cannot subject the CAS decision to any free legal control. On the contrary, its examination of the content is limited by law to the question of whether the CAS decision violates fundamental and widely regarded principles of public order. That is not the case. So effectively the things that they can decide on, by the way, is whether there's a sort of fundamental disregard of human rights and also whether they've sort of applied the processes that they should have applied. Caster Semenya essentially alleges a violation of the prohibition of discrimination. For the Swiss Federal Supreme Court, the CAS has issued a binding decision based on the unanimous opinion of the experts who were consulted that testosterone is the main factor for the different performance levels of the sexes in athletics. According to the CAS, women with the 46XY DSD gene variant have a testosterone level comparable to men, which gives them an insurmountable competitive advantage and enables them to beat female athletes without the 46XY DSD variant. Based on these findings, the CAS decision cannot be challenged. Fairness in sport is a legitimate concern and forms a central principle of sporting competition. It is one of the pillars on which competition is based. The European Court of Human Rights also attaches particular importance to the aspect of fair competition. In addition to this significant public interest, the CAS rightly considered the other relevant interests, namely the private interests of the female athletes running in the women category. Its decision is also compatible with public order from the point of view of Caster Semenya's alleged violation of her personality and human dignity. The medical clarifications and any necessary drug-related lowering of the testosterone level represent a considerable interference with physical integrity. However, the core area of this right is not affected. It should also be noted that the examinations are carried out by qualified doctors and under no circumstances against the will of any female athletes. Ultimately, the CAS decision is also compatible with the guarantee of human dignity. Implicated female athletes are free to refuse treatment to lower testosterone levels. The decision also does not aim to question in any way the female sex of implicated female athletes. Okay, so there's quite a few things to discuss here, but I think the first go-to should be to try and explain some of this yet again confusion around the use of the word female that our societies seem intent on imposing on us. Our societies, the way they are heading now, are trying to differentiate between sex and gender. And I have no problem with that. I can see good reasons for that. But then at the same time, they confound all the good work by then using the terms we use for sex to refer to gender. And nowhere is this more prevalent than in this idea of legal sex, which is where the sex terms are used to underline your gender identity. It never helps. It is never helpful, this. I've said this before with regard to documents like passports and birth certificates. If what we want to show on them is biological sex, then show biological sex. If we've decided, as we have, that we don't need to show biological sex on them because we're not showing it, we're showing legal sex, which refers to gender identity, then let's stop calling it sex. Let's call it gender. Let's scrub that category of sex off those documents and write gender, and instead of putting an M or an F, let's put an M or a W. If that is what we are showing, then let's make it clear instead of saying, well, sex is this thing and gender's this thing, but now let's use the sex terms to distinguish somebody's gender. It doesn't help. And again, it is just confounding and confusing what the Swiss Federal Supreme Court is talking about here, because on the one hand they are talking about femaleness in terms of competition, but they're also talking about female athletes with 46XY DSDs. What they're talking about here is people like Caster Semenya who are legally female. And indeed, this confusion has arisen all the way through. Right at the start of the CAS hearing, the IAAF, as was World Athletics, were very clear that we're not questioning Caster Semenya's sex, right? We accept that she is female, and then they go on within the hearing to talk about how effectively she's a biological male. They clarified it. They're saying we're not, just for clarification, we're not disputing her legal sex, but we're saying that legal sex is not what is important. What is important is biological sex. And this is happening all the way down the line. As you will see in a few minutes, Caster Semenya uses it in quite a manipulative way. She talks about how she's a female athlete. I think understanding that most people not aware of this, oblivious to this, will view that as saying that she is a biologically female athlete who just has these miraculous levels of testosterone, whereas she is referring to her legal sex, but she never refers to it as legal sex. She just says she's female. So this is a problem here. Bear that in mind when you read these things. The next thing is the fact that this is a discrimination claim, and this is something else that confuses people. The IAAF, as was World Athletics, were discriminating. Nobody disputes that. The Court of Arbitration for Sport said that they are discriminating. The business of sports categories, ladies and gentlemen, is to discriminate. Right. Otherwise, you couldn't have them. You couldn't have a women's category. You couldn't, or a female category. You couldn't have an age category. You couldn't have a weight category without discriminating. You're discriminating anyway, regardless of where Caster Semenya is allowed to compete. The fact that I cannot compete in the women's 800 metres is discriminatory, but it's regarded as acceptable discrimination because it is a legitimate means, or it's a proportionate means, I should say, to achieve a legitimate aim. So we can't just look at this word of discrimination as a scare word. If there's discrimination, it's wrong, because if it wasn't for discrimination, you could only have one category, and everybody of all ages, of all weights, of all sizes, male and female, would all have to compete in the same category. There was a lot of talk about, of course, in the CAS hearing, and it's mentioned here, about the privacy dignity issues. It kind of puts a smile on my face here. I've heard a lot of talk on this on the internet. It's disgraceful that nobody should have to show their genitals to another person. That's a human rights issue, and that's why this shouldn't be allowed. The fact is, if you're Primož Roglic at the Tour de France this year in the yellow jersey, every stage you will have to urinate in full view of somebody, right? Because otherwise you could have a little bag of somebody else's urine with a little drip feeding thing next to your penis. It could be somebody else's urine you are submitting. It happened in the past, so now it has to be done in full view to check that you're not doing that, right? This is something that is just so normal. In terms of anti-doping, it's not even mentioned, and nobody's banging the table with regard to human rights infringements there, but seemingly people that don't know very much about sport and don't realise that this goes on all the time anyway, see there's this terrible imposition taking place here that nobody else has to undergo within sport. In terms, we talked about medical requirements and forced to lower testosterone. For me, this is it's a bit of a banal argument. If I wanted to compete in that category, I would have to lower my testosterone as well, and I would have to identify as a woman. If I wanted to compete in the featherweight category, I would be forced to lower my weight, right? This is just the way it goes. We have a criteria. The fact is that Caster Semenya does not qualify for that category because she is male, and it is a category designed to exclude biological males. What am I not missing there? So in terms of an imposition, yes, it is an imposition. If she wishes to compete in that category, she will have to do it, but so would anybody else who didn't meet the qualifying criteria for that category. And that is 50% of the world's population, not just Caster Semenya, Francine Niyonsaba and Margaret Wambui. Another issue that springs to mind with regard to that is this argument, and there is some legitimacy to this argument, the complaint that somehow they're targeting Caster Semenya because it only includes a few events. It's effectively from the 400 metres up to the mile. So that would be 400 metres, 800 metres, 1500 metres, and the mile. I presume the 400 metres hurdles as well, I would think. So these are the events that are included in this. Why not the other events? Why not indeed? And as far as I'm aware, this stems back from the last Dutty Chan case, where that was thrown out by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And it was thrown out, and what the Court of Arbitration for Sport said is effectively you're going to have to evidence this, right? It's unlike anything else that you would see in doping or performance enhancement, where we don't say, well, if you want to proscribe EPO, then you have to show in every single sport and every single discipline that people are winning more if they've got it. No, we just know that this gives an advantage, and so we say, well, if it gives an advantage and we think that advantage is unfair, then we can apply it across the board. You would think the same thing would apply here. If we think this gives an advantage, having testes knocking out 20 nanomoles of testosterone, which it obviously does, then if we think it gives an advantage and we think that advantage is unfair, which I think is a legitimate thing to think in a sporting category that is intended to exclude people with testes knocking out those levels of testosterone, then we could just apply it across the board. But the Court of Arbitration for Sport wasn't happy with that with the previous regulations. They were slightly different regulations, of course. And so I think that the IAAF went back trying to fulfill those requirements and to try and show, to highlight, yes, in these events we can see a difference. And so it only ended up applying to those events that they were sort of focused in. Really, it should have applied across the board. Why shouldn't it apply to the 100 metres? If it gives you an advantage in those middle distance events, I'm sure it gives you an advantage in the marathon and the 50 kilometres walk and in the 100 metres and in the hammer and in the javelin. Of course it does, but it hasn't applied to them. Maybe if the IAAF, as was World Athletics now, had realised that the Court of Arbitration for Sport would lean less, as it turned out, on the evidential argument and more on the sort of philosophical principle of it, that having testes kicking out male levels of testosterone that your body responds to is kind of incompatible with competing in female athletics, that they would have just applied it across the board, and maybe that will change. Okay, that's what I have to say with regard to that. Now, there's still a few more things that I want to talk about here. The first is the way that this has been reported in the media, and it is very sad in my view, in that this has been misreported in the media for a long time now, and in a way that is sort of softballed Caster Semenya. It's given her a lot of public sympathy that I think if people knew what her condition actually was, she would not have got. Right. People have had this idea of Caster Semenya that she's just some kind of miracle female who is being punished for being a miracle. People talk about Michael Phelps and the fact that he has 50-foot long arms and feet that work like outboard motors, and he's not punished for these things. So if he's not punished for those things, how come poor old Caster Semenya is being punished for just having this genetic miracle? Of course, it's not a genetic miracle, it's that she's male competing in a female category. That is not a miracle any more than I'm a female miracle, I'm afraid. But that's the way that it's been portrayed. And the egregious thing as far as the press is concerned, in my view, is that as these things have come to light, as we've known more about her condition, they haven't really altered the way that they're reporting it. And I'll show you how the BBC has reported this latest bit in a minute. But first let me explain how this has come to light, because this is this principle of medical confidentiality, which I think Caster Semenya has benefited from for a good decade now. So what has changed? Well, the principle of medical confidentiality means that we have no right to know the medical specifics of Caster Semenya, and she is under no obligation to tell us. There is a certain irony here, which is if you look at something like the Tour de France and cycling, people are all up in arms that there isn't sufficient clarity, there isn't sufficient openness, and these claims that we should know. If one of these cyclists has a condition, then we should know about it because that could affect their performance, and we need this kind of clarity to check that nobody is cheating or doping or something like that. And it's kind of strange that with regard to Caster Semenya and the multiple accusations that the way she's treated is as a result of racism and sexism, that when it comes to a bunch of white blokes riding round on their bicycles, we're all banging the tables demanding medical confidentiality be damned. We want to know what their medical situations are, but when it comes to a black female runner, everybody's banging the table demanding that we uphold her medical confidentiality. But she has maintained her medical confidentiality, but as a result of the IAAF's regulations, and as a result of what happened at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, we can be 99.99% certain what her condition is. The reason is, if she was not 46XY, if she did not have these very high levels of testosterone as a result of having a set of internal testes that her body responds to, right, that her body can respond to the testosterone, she's sensitive to testosterone. If she's not these things, then the regulations would not apply. So we already know that. That is a cast iron copper bottomed guarantee that she has one of these 5 qualifying conditions, disorders of sex development that affect biological males. We also know as a result, if you read through the entire Court of Arbitration for Sport document, what we know is that throughout this document, of those 5 things, the one that they talk about, the one that Caster Semenya's team talks about, the one that Athletics South Africa talks about, and on the other side of the table that World Athletics talks about, is 5-alpha reductase deficiency. Each and every time that is the one that's discussed. The IAAF, as was World Athletics, says that 5-alpha reductase deficiency means that you will go through a male puberty. At the very least, I think you've gone through a male puberty light, not a female puberty as a result of that. You produce testosterone, your body responds normally testosterone. It's just that your testes do not metabolize that into dihydrotestosterone, which means that while you're in the womb there, although your testes have developed perfectly, your external genitalia, which effectively develop more in the presence of dihydrotestosterone than testosterone, do not develop normally, so that when you are born, you are often erroneously diagnosed as female. That is what happens in that condition. Now, if that was not her condition, I propose to you, as soon as the IAAF mentioned it, her team would have said, well, okay, maybe that's true, but given that that isn't our client's condition, what relevance is that? The fact that they discussed that condition and defended Caster Semenya on the basis of that decision tells us, I think, to the 99.999% level that that is the condition that she has. So the papers should know that. They should be able to tell us some of this. This is what BBC had to say. Caster Semenya loses appeal against the restriction of testosterone levels in female runners. Caster Semenya has lost her appeal to Switzerland's Federal Supreme Court against the restriction of testosterone levels in female runners. Semenya is not allowed to compete in events between 400 metres and a mile without taking testosterone-reducing drugs, following a 2009 rule change by the governing body World Athletics. I am very disappointed, the 29-year-old South African said. I refuse to let World Athletics drug me or stop me from being who I am. Athletics governing body brought in a rule that athletes with differences of sexual development, DSD, must either take medication in order to compete in track events from 400 metres to the mile or change to another distance. Athletes with DSDs have higher levels of natural testosterone, which World Athletics believes gives them a competitive advantage. Note at no point here does the BBC mention the fact that of all the myriad DSDs out there, it's only 5 DSDs, and they are all DSDs that affect biological males. Nowhere does it mention being 46XY. Nowhere does it mention the fact that Caster Semenya has a set of testes, not ovaries, that are giving her this high level of testosterone. And they never mention it, right? They had an excuse for that 5 years ago. They don't have an excuse for it anymore. This is what Caster Semenya went on to say. Excluding female athletes or endangering our health solely because of our natural abilities puts World Athletics on the wrong side of history. I will continue to fight for the human rights of female athletes, both on the track and off the track, until we can all run free in the way we were born. I know what is right and will do all I can to protect basic human rights for young girls everywhere. So this is the part of the video I start slagging off Caster Semenya. And it's kind of irked me because nearly every discussion you hear with regards to the sort of the great and the good involved in this always waxes lyrical about it doesn't matter what the issues are. I don't want to criticise Caster Semenya. She's been she's maintained her dignity throughout all of this. And I have to say bollocks. Quite honestly, she may have maintained some dignity and she may have seemed sniffily aloof to some of it, but I think she's played a very, very cynical and manipulative game. She has used her medical confidentiality to her advantage. Even now, she talks about the fact that she's a female and she's doing this as a female and she's been ordered to alter as a female. She can say that technically and that her legal sex is female, but she's not biologically female. And she knows, she's not stupid, she knows that when she mentions being female, people assume that means she has ovaries, that she's a female athlete. They don't assume for one moment that the reason that she has this extraordinary level of testosterone is because she's got a set of balls in her body, quite frankly, that are kicking out this level of testosterone, that she effectively went through a male puberty. Most people don't think that for a minute. And so over the past decade, she has got a huge amount of sympathy, effectively because people are labouring under a misunderstanding. I was, for a long period of time, that effectively she was this is some kind of female miracle. It's a miracle that a female is able to produce this level of testosterone, but isn't that what sport's about? If genetics are working in your favour, then fine. People now keep talking about this Michael Phelps example, and if it's how fair for him to compete, why isn't it fair for Caster Semenya to compete? You can understand that. If you see Caster Semenya as a biological female, then she qualifies for that category, so it shouldn't matter if she's got some incredible mega mutation that makes her better than everybody else. But if the genetic difference she has is that genetically she's male, and instead of having ovaries she's got testes, and the reason that she produces this incredibly high level of testosterone for a female is because she's not effectively female, right? Then it isn't a female miracle any more than I am a female miracle. And I can only say that Caster Semenya has looked on at this and looked on at the support she's got for the past 10 years and known that a vast majority of that support exists because people have a misunderstanding of what her condition is, and she has never clarified that. Instead, she's just hidden behind her medical confidentiality and allowed her to benefit, accrue this support all the time. And even now we know that she has 5-alpha reductase deficiency, that she's 46XY, that she has a set of testes in her body, that all these years has been given her male levels of testosterone. That means she has gone through a male puberty or something almost adjacent, almost next to a male puberty, a long way away from a female puberty. That she is effectively the kind of person that the female category was intended to segregate out, to ring fence, to place outside the category boundary. Even though she knows that, and even though it's now clear, she still never mentions her condition, because as soon as she mentions her condition, then the papers are much more likely to start giving the facts rather than still giving the same crap. That even the BBC, it's supposed to be unbiased, it's supposed to give you all the stuff, it never ever mentions the facts. And that is the norm within the media. Again and again they report on Caster Semenya, and even now they report it as if she's just some kind of female miracle that we can't explain, that just might have some kind of intersex condition, and she keeps playing into that, knowing that that gets her a whole load of support. I have to say, support that she doesn't deserve. Because if it's support that is based upon a misapprehension, then that is not deserved support. Now, that is not to say that I do not have some sympathy for Caster Semenya. It's a terrible thing to spend your formative years training up for an event, dedicating your life, hoping that you're going to be the best, and then have that crashed on the rocks. But I have to say, that is the norm within sport, right? It happens for myriad reasons. People don't have the funding. they reach natural limits before they ever get to the top. They have an injury. How many people do we know that could have made it as a professional footballer, but then they injure their knee, they injure their ankle? These things happen all the time. The story of sport is the story of people devoting their formative years to trying to excel with these dreams that they can make it and never making it. Caster Semenya's had a good decade plus at the top level, right? So although I have some sympathy for her, I have no more sympathy for her than I do for these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of other people that devote themselves in exactly the same way to their disciplines, but for one reason or another, their plans are confounded. They are crashed upon the rocks and they never make it to be successful at sport at the elite level. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was this. This was from Stonewall UK. Stonewall UK, by the way, used to be a sort of really big thing. I remember sort of when I was young, Stonewall looking out for gay rights, gay and lesbian rights, and sort of equality and all this kind of thing. But like we see with a lot of these things now, they've become sort of woke. It's different people at the helm. I think it's these organisations that are very revolutionary can never stop being revolutionary. So the kind of people that were foundational to Stonewall back in the day, the people who run Stonewall now wouldn't want anything to do with, right? Because it's like a boulder rolling down a mountain, and it can't lose its momentum. But this is a mountain that goes on forever, and undoubtedly the people that are running Stonewall now will be the hate figures in another couple of decades, because there will be some issue that they're not on board with. This is what Stonewall had to say with regard to this. This is comedy gold, this. So the series of 4 tweets starts off: very disappointing decision. Caster won't be able to run in the Tokyo Olympics unless she alters her body. Content warning: discrimination, racism. The ruling is racist and rooted in misogynoir. The athlete's case proves that in sport, all women have to adhere to the blueprint laid forth by the bodies of white European women in order to participate. The constant scrutiny into Semenya's medical history reveals what happens to women who don't conform to frameworks centred on white women. It sets a dangerous precedent in regulating how people participate in sport. What's happened today is a missed opportunity to send a positive message to women of all races, shapes, sizes and abilities that sport is open and welcoming of everyone. Okay, where do I begin with all of this? I think the first thing that I should say is the accusation that this is misogynoir. If you're not aware of what misogynoir is, it is supposed to be, it's sort of like the confluence of sexism and racism that black women experience. So if you're experiencing some kind of bigotry on the grounds that you're both black and a woman, then that is misogynoir. You may think, given everything that's been happening in America at the moment, with all these things that's triggered all these Black Lives Matter things, where the victims have predominantly been black men, seemingly on the grounds, the inescapable grounds that they are black and male, that misandrinoir would be an expression that would be used as well. But it doesn't appear to be. The fact that they're men seems to be a sort of inconvenient fact with regard to that. But I would point out, if I can just appropriate their language, that effectively the problem here is not that misogynoir, that she's a victim of misogynoir. If I can appropriate their language, it's that Stonewall UK views everything through a misandry blanc lens, which is that if something is a problem and they don't like it, then it's as a result of white men, effectively. There is no reason. This blueprint laid forth by the bodies of white European women, maybe there's something I don't know. Maybe sub-Saharan African women somehow I've got to 48 years old and I didn't know that they are the sole exception in the whole of the sexually reproducing animal kingdom, which is that female sub-Saharan African women have testes that produce sperm. I wasn't aware of that. I don't know how that's passed me by, and I don't know how it works. But as far as I'm aware, that the idea that to be a biological female, that you don't have testes and a chromosomally 46XY and sensitive to androgens isn't something that's a white female European thing here. This is just absolute rubbish. And the idea that this is sexism kind of baffles me here. Look, if I want to try and be a sexist here, right, that's what some people would say, well, you're well on the way, Jim, anyway, right, so there's no problem. If I wanted to do that, and I want to do women down, right, that's what I want to do. I want to do women down, right? Look at it this way. If I can stop a woman being prime minister, right, then there's a good chance that a man will be prime minister instead, and that'll be a win for the men, for the men's, right? If I'm in America, if I can stop a woman being president, then a man will get it instead, and that's one up for us, right? We're doing down the women yet again, right? But this is the women's 800 metres, for crying out loud, right? If you ban a woman or render a woman ineligible for competing there, newsflash, it ain't going to be a man that wins it. It's going to be another woman. If you render ineligible the first 100 women, it'll be the 101st woman that wins, right? Even if you rendered ineligible every single woman on the planet, it still wouldn't be won by a man. It would just be that nobody won it, right? So you'd have to be a really stupid sexist to pick this as a target for your sexism, I think, here. And what's ludicrous about this, right, is that this reminds me of something that I said, that I've been saying since 2012 with regard to certain groups of feminists and patriarchy blaming, which is that it's just an argument you can make both ways, right? It's sort of patriarchy and sexism both ways. I once gave the analogy years back that if I stood on top of a wall, this is how easy it is to make these arguments. If I stood on top of a wall and there's all men and women milling around below me, if I offer up my hand to the men, right, and lift up the men, then that's the patriarchy, that's sexism, that's men helping out other men, giving them a lift up while leaving the women there to flounder on their own. So that's sexist, it's patriarchy, right? But if I do the opposite, if I leave the men to flounder and I lift up the women, then that's sexist as well, because the implication is that the women need my help, whereas the men can make it on their own. I'm being paternalistic. That's another example of the patriarchy. That's another example, in this case, of benevolent sexism in the way that I am acting. You can have it both ways round. And this is what has happened with regard to this argument. So you have a situation like this where people are not happy that people like Caster Semenya are allowed to compete, or not happy that anybody who identifies as a woman isn't allowed to compete, that is sexism because you're discriminating against these women. So it's sexism against women. But on the other end of the counter, the people who are taking the total opposite position are portraying this as sexism against women as well, for a different set of reasons, but it's the same thing. They're portraying it as sexist against women because what you're doing is you're undermining female spaces, and you're undermining cis women by not allowing them a place. That effectively you're allowing males to now come in and take away their opportunities to compete at the highest level. So yeah, yet again, males are going to start dominating. We can't even have this little refuge anymore. And what this shows, right, apart from the fact it's all a load of bollocks and hokum, and that's not the way to argue. Argue on the facts, not on the basis of these labels like misogyny, sexism, patriarchy, because that's all just bollocks, right? That's padding. It's not an argument in itself. It's a word that you can give to bundle things together, but it's not an argument in itself, right? But what it shows is that we've empowered these terms to such an extent that they're thrown around like confetti, terms like misogyny and sexism. You just throw them in, because what it says is if you can just say, oh, women are the victims, that's enough. You don't really need to say very much more. It's kind of like a little auto win button that you're pressing there. And I'm kind of getting tired of it. Right, I am kind of getting tired of that. It's a crap way of arguing, and it's so asymmetric, it's so one-sided in the way that it's apportioned that it's just not true. And our society is not that one-sided. On some issues it is, some issues there is sexism and women are on the receiving end of it, but society is not as one-sided as the way that these terms are used. It also says that it sets a dangerous precedent in regulating how people participate in sport. If it's setting a dangerous precedent, I'd love to know what it is. Presumably the fact that I'm not allowed to compete as a featherweight because I'm 95 kilos. It's not my fault I'm 95 kilos. I'm naturally 95 kilos, right? Why should I be discriminated against on the grounds that I'm a 95 kilo featherweight, right, and making me ineligible? It's not setting a dangerous participant, regulating how people can participate in sport to say that we have these boundaries, and if you're outside of the boundary, wow, you're not allowed to compete within the boundary. If you're 44, you can't compete in the under 16s, right? Naturally, yes, you're 44, that's your natural age, you can do nothing about it, but I'm afraid you still don't qualify for the under 18s. These aren't dangerous precedents. It would be a dangerous precedent if we didn't do these things, if we didn't uphold these boundaries, because if we don't uphold them, we may as well not have them. What's happened today is a missed opportunity to send a positive message to women of all races, shapes, sizes and ability that sport is open and welcoming of everyone. Sport should certainly be those things, and there should be a place in sport for everybody. And there are places within sport for Caster Semenya. But having a place in sport doesn't mean that you get to unilaterally dictate which categories that you get to compete in, and that you get to choose a category that you think that you can win in that isn't intended to apply to you. Okay, this whole Stonewall tweet is the kind of thing that can only exist in an ecosystem of misunderstanding and misinformation. An ecosystem of misinformation that the press has now allowed to maintain for over a decade now, even though they now know the truth. Caster Semenya herself has allowed this kind of thing to fester. And even though we know the truth, the problem is it takes a lot of outlining. It's not something that you can easily do. And she knows that as long as she keeps her mouth shut, doesn't talk about her condition, doesn't admit to what her condition is, and just keeps calling herself this natural female, and this is just the way I am, and people aren't allowing me to be the way that I am, right, that she gets a whole lot of sympathy based upon a misunderstanding, a misapprehension of the facts. I think Caster Semenya, pardon me for the pun, has run her course with regard to this. But these situations, these arguments still exist. This document still exists. Will it expand to include more disciplines? I hope so. Really, given that it's the philosophical principle, the principle that being biologically male and having those advantages is untenable in a category intended to exclude male pubertal development, notwithstanding the trans issue of whether testosterone reduction can make a difference. If it does, then we can make an exception for that. And I'm not disputing that. It's a separate issue. Okay? But these are all things that are live issues. It really should be applying, I think, to all their disciplines. The IOC is still deliberating how it's going to alter its guidelines with regard to trans athletes. That's something that's going to come out in the future. There's still a lot of live issues with regard to that. There's still a lot of debate that's going to take place. It will be interesting to see where this goes next. But it would be nice if the media could start reporting this a bit more responsibly. And responsible reporting is not giving kind of euphemisms and sort of vague hand-waving allusions to intersex conditions, perhaps. Who knows, right? It is reporting what we know so that people can make an informed decision, not an uninformed decision. Okay, That's what I have to say with regard to that. I am sure many of you will have some feedback, some comeback, some criticism with regard to some of what I've said there. Leave it in comments, send me a tweet, like I say, carry a pigeon, whatever you like, right? Get in touch, interested to know what you have to say. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to support my material, you can do so via Patreon. I don't make so many videos at the moment, only 1 or 2 per month, and I do it on a per video basis if you'd like to support this material. That's it for now. Thank you for watching, and bye.